Hey there. Welcome to a special bonus episode of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. So hi, it's me, Eric. I'm your host. If you listened to the episode I published just a couple of days ago, the interview with Ken Meyer, I mentioned in there that I was going to be talking about hemp as a livestock feed in this bonus episode. And yes, that's what's happening here today. So first, I just need to tell you a few things to bring you up to speed on what's happening. As of right now, here, April 2024, it is illegal for commercial livestock producers to feed hemp grain to their animals. You can feed hemp to your kids, but not to your cows. So the livestock feed sector is overseen by a group called AAFCO. It's the American Association of Feed Control Officials. That's sort of connected to the FDA and I think it's the Center for Veterinary Medicine. And so they control it, they oversee it, and this is to keep our food supply safe. So if a new ingredient comes along, there's a process through which that ingredient gets sort of reviewed and tested and then hopefully gains approval and can be used as a livestock feed. When this system was invented in the 20th century, a lot of crops were grandfathered in, like corn and soy, things that we had been generally feeding to animals for a very long time. But hemp was illegal then, so it was not grandfathered in, although there is ample anecdotal evidence to show that humans have been feeding hemp to animals for a very, very long time. So hemp grain, as we know, is very nutritious. It's high in protein, fiber, it's got an amazing amino acid profile, the omegas, all that stuff. And if hemp grain were able to enter into the livestock feed market, it would send a bolt of energy through the industry. Oilseed producers would have a secondary market for their cake, which is the byproduct of crushing seed for oil, and hemp grain farmers would get a better price for their crops. Now, I'm sure I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but I'm a simpleton, and that's okay. And so by cracking open the livestock markets, it'll have a ripple effect throughout the industry. It'll be good for hemp producers and livestock producers alike. But the process to gain approval is arduous and expensive. AAFCO requires lots of testing to show an ingredient is safe, and these tests are expensive. And like I said before, we should all be thankful for the system because it keeps us safe. But now hemp's time has come. The HFC, the Hemp Feed Coalition, has been working tirelessly for years to get approval for hemp grain as a feed for livestock, and specifically they chose laying hens as their first sort of species, as their first livestock group that they're looking at, because of course you can't just get approval for the ingredient, you have to do it not just by species but by subspecies. So they're going down the laying hen avenue. And so a couple of months ago, it was sort of given the nod from the FDA CVM, and it looks, and AAFCO has given it tentative approval, but there's a final vote coming up this August. And everyone is very hopeful that it's going to be approved. It seems likely, but it's not a done deal yet. So last week, an advocacy group called Agriculture Policy Solutions published a blog post that could potentially throw a wrench in this August vote. Basically, the post expresses concerns about the current tentative definition for hemp, and it calls that definition a poison pill for the industry. It says that the THC limits in the proposed definition are too stringent, and it wants to sort of lower those THC limits, and it also wants to basically get rid of the CBD limit altogether. Now, understand that the hemp seed contains no cannabinoids. They're just not biologically present in the seed. Those compounds develop in the flower of the plant. And so the concern here isn't that THC or CBD is actually in the grain itself. The concern is that it's a contamination. Because the seed develops in the flowers, there can be trace amounts of these cannabinoids on the outside of the seeds. So it's a cleaning issue. So AAFCO wants to make sure that the seeds are safe and that these cannabinoidal compounds don't accumulate in the animal and then are passed on into the human food chain. So this blog post has ruffled some feathers and has created some confusion around the topic and could potentially jeopardize hemp's approval in August. So today we're going to hear first from Andrew Bish, president of the Hemp Feed Coalition, and Morgan Tweet, executive director of the Hemp Feed Coalition. We're going to hear their reaction and their response to this poison pill blog piece. And then I'm going to talk to Hunter Buffington, the author of the Poison Pill blog post. She is from Agriculture Policy Solutions. I want to get her perspective. After talking to Andrew and Morgan, I have questions for Hunter, so I ask her those. And then I have more questions for Morgan after that. So after I talk to Hunter, I then have a few follow-up questions with Morgan. So this may or may not be a controversial episode. I hope it's not. I just really want to lay it all out there for you because getting hemp approved as a livestock feed is critical to the success of industrial hemp. Okay, hello, Morgan and Andrew. Here from the Hemp Feed Coalition, Morgan Tweet and Andrew Bish. Welcome. How are you? Happy April.
Good morning. Yeah.
Good morning.
So here we are. We're talking about hemp feed, right? And last week there was an article published online that described the tentative definition for hemp seed meal as a poison pill for the hemp industry. And I felt like that seemed a little, I don't know, hyperbolic isn't even the word, but that's a bit much. All right, but I don't want to weigh in on my opinion because I want to hear your perspective on this article.
Eric, thank you for having us today. We did see the article, and I appreciate you letting us on your show. We think that it's important that people understand not just what it was said in this article and our response, but what the potential consequences of this conversation are. And today's a good opportunity for us to do that.
Ag Policy Solutions is a group of individuals that originally were part of the Hemp Feed Coalition. So they do have a little bit more knowledge of the initial application that went forward and the data collection there. They've spun off and done a little bit of their own work. They've done some applications for some grass statuses in some other states. So they're passionate about hemp and animal feed. I think collectively, we all have the same goal. We want to see hemp approved as an animal feed ingredient. I think we just have a little bit different pathway that we're pursuing. And the synopsis of their blog post and their summary was their voice of concern, mostly around the cannabinoid thresholds that were proposed for hemp seed meal for laying hens. And so, we do want to go into more detail about how we got to those numbers, the conversation pathway there. We also want to be on record that there's a lot of inaccuracies in that blog post. And so we'll call those out. We actually have our own kind of reciprocal article. We'll link to that here as well to talk about that in more detail. But unfortunately, what we are concerned about and why it's important for us to get in front of people is that there's a little bit of a narrative being described here that this is not an accomplishment for the industry and that this is I just said like a poison pill, right? That this is something that we're accepting that won't do good things when that's not the case. We definitely have some similar viewpoints on our concerns, but we recognize the pathway to approval and the pathway for increasing thresholds and increasing just adoption in the market, that this is a stair-stepped approach. This isn't a one-time, all you can get in one application. We do have an opportunity to change it in the future. And we see that the risk of jeopardizing approval in August is far too high, and that we need to just first accomplish the application and the tentative definition as it is today.
Okay. First, give us the little background on, you mentioned August, the vote in August, so maybe some listeners aren't up to speed on what's happening, but you've got it's approved tentatively, right? Hemp grain meal for laying hens, but there's an official vote in August with AAFCO. Do I have that right?
Yep. Yep, there's a couple different processes there. We started in the ingredient definition committee. That was the vote in January. That was the first big accomplishment because basically FDA CVM recommended approval of this tentative definition to IDC. IDC then voted on it where it passed essentially unanimously. They had one person abstain from voting, but no concerns. From there, it went to the AAFCO board. They voted on it last week and approved it. So now it goes to membership in August. And the only voting members are regulators. So industry has a voice, but we don't have a vote. And so the voting members are regulators, and that will happen in August.
Okay. And so that whole process, this thing of getting this ingredient approved and ready to go for hemp meal for laying hens, that whole thing is what is being described as a poison pill for the hemp industry? Am I reading that right? Or is it like there's some details in this, and that's the thresholds of cannabinoids?
I think it's the details. I think overall the application and the motivation to get hemp seed meal approved for laying hens is widely adopted as a good thing. It's in the devil's in the details, right? And at this point, they're talking specifically because ingredient definitions are extremely specific. And so AAFCO publishes a book every year, and any sort of nuances to any ingredient. I mean, we're talking about DDGs, like, soybean meal, all kinds of different ingredients that are found in animal feed. Those are they're scrutinized with a very fine tooth comb. And so this is very specific. And I think that's their concern is on some of those specificities.
Yeah, when I was reading through this, the way that I read it is that APS is trying to communicate that the standards that are set here are effectively impossible for producers to accomplish. And I think that throughout today and what we're going to talk to you about, we'll show that just happens to not be the case. And so when you talk about the poison pill, I think that the poison pill here is this idea, again, that processors can't meet these limits, which they most certainly can. And we have done this consistently, which is how we know that processors can, in fact, meet these limits.
There's several sections when you submit an application, and a couple of them are specific to like the chemistry. So like what are you defining the ingredient as? This is everything from like protein, fat, fiber content. You also look at contaminants. So like heavy metals, pesticides, in this case, cannabinoids. So we had to really define when we say what is hemp seed meal, we had to provide really good data for what that is. And then another section is called manufacturing chemistries. And so you have to go into great detail of like, how does one make hemp seed meal? And so this process started 3+ years ago. And there was a steering committee of hemp seed processors who all contributed to this manufacturing definition. This was like when I first started in HFC, this was part of the process that I got engaged with since I was very familiar with how hemp seed meal is processed. There's other very reputable companies on the call, and all of us looked at this draft of what hemp seed meal is. And we talked about, the goal of HFC is to be as broad as possible so that as many hemp processors can participate and take advantage of these markets that we're opening. And so it comes down to that that manufacturing definition. That's really where, the rubber meets the road. And so, we've never changed the manufacturing definition in the 3+ years that we've had this ongoing conversation with FDA. There was never any question into like, how do you make hemp seed meal? And so we called out, good manufacturing practices. Processors should have good COAs going into their process. They should understand, what the seed looks like coming in. And then we called out traditional seed cleaning equipment. And we tried to be, again, broad, because there's definitely different ways to skin that cat. And there's a lot of, essentially we're just trying to remove foreign material and get clean hemp seed. And then that's taken to a mechanical press that is specific. You can read it when you look at AAFCO's ingredient. It's the product obtained by grinding or milling cake, which remains after most of the oil is removed from the seed, by a mechanical extraction process. That's pretty critical. Of all the things in the manufacturing description, that's critical because, as we know, there are other ways to remove oil. Solvent extraction is probably the most widely known and probably the most effective. And but because there are other remaining potentially volatiles in the product, we wanted this specifically to be for mechanical extraction. And so
just to keep it clean.
Yeah. Keep it clean, keep it simple.
Why introduce extra stuff into it? Yeah.
And that's what's on the market today. Like when you look at what hemp processors are doing, they are mechanically extracting the oil. There's very few that are doing anything besides that. So this was our first application. We wanted it to be successful. We wanted it to be, advantageous for as many processors as possible. And so that's really like, we've never changed that. That's always been the objective. The 2.5+ years of back and forth was more around the literature review, the feed study that we did, and then obviously the eggs and potential cannabinoid transference in the eggs.
And talk a little bit about that transference. Is there transference?
Not that we've seen. There's been 3 different studies now. The initial one was in 2020. And that was on a pretty wide commercial hen operation. They did another study to support a grass application in Pennsylvania. And then we did a subsequent feeding study recognizing the commercial operation and capturing eggs off of commercial hens. So we've 3 different times now, we've fed chickens hemp seed meal and enriched, laying hen diet with hemp seed meal at 20% inclusion. And we haven't seen cannabinoids in the eggs yet.
Yeah. When you talk about transference, by the way, Eric, Kansas State has done a pretty extensive testing on transference, not necessarily with chickens and eggs. And most of their study has been focused on feeding high amounts of cannabinoids. You got to consider that hemp seed itself, cannabinoids aren't naturally occurring. So cannabinoids that exist are there as a result of transference from the plant. And because the levels are so low, once we've introduced them into the feed, the likelihood of transference beyond that level is extremely unlikely to occur. And if it does occur, would be occurring at levels that are unmeasurable at this point.
It's not like what we have in place now might be the absolute perfect thing for everybody, but it's a start, and it's a thing that can only get better from here. I think maybe the article is positioned from a standpoint that this is going to be the standard forever. And the reality is it is the standard that we have achieved based on samples that we have provided. In this particular situation, we really were graded by the stick that we provided. And we don't have samples that show higher levels of cannabinoids that were fed to chickens to begin with. So the way around these levels is actually one of 2 ways. One way would be to produce naturally occurring samples of grain that naturally occur higher levels of cannabinoids, likely from plant transference, or the FDA sets safe standards for human cannabinoid level. And I wish that this article were focused on B, which is a much more advantageous avenue to go down, as this seems to be the crux of most of the problems in the industry as we talk about cannabinoids in general. The question always comes up, what is the safe level to humans? And since that's not been established, this creates a challenge for us at the Hemp Feed Coalition, as this is one of the first times there really has been a safe level established.
Yeah, and I think something also APS hits on is that this is going to set the stage for the world. And granted, the U.S. does have a bit of a platform right now, and we do get to share that. But we've been in contact with EIHA, with CHTA. We know that there's a potential here for other global partners and regulators to look at this. But we don't see that as a concern that this isn't something that we can move off. We've had several conversations with FDA, CBM, and AAFCO. They have made it clear that they will amend the levels if we get more data that shows that we can continue. But to Andrew's point, FDA, CBM is the feed side of the business, right? And unfortunately, they don't talk to their counterparts on the human side in FDA. And so they don't want to take the leadership and be the ones that put, a known amount of CBD into the human food supply chain. That's not their goal. That's not their strike zone. they really want to defer that to FDA. So to Andrew's point, like that's probably the bigger problem here. And we need to push and like shine light on that, because the zero tolerance policy that FDA CVM is taking is bred off of that, unknown. And so they don't have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to CBD in the animals. They just don't feel comfortable of allowing CBDs through the supply chain. And so the buck stops at the egg, right? And so I think that like if we are concerned and if we want to look at other, global partners, Europe has been feeding animals, hemp grain for a very long time, but they don't test for it, right? They don't test for these things. If anything, Europe probably is going to say like, we don't want our regulators to hear about this because they don't even test for it right now. It's not a concern. So like, it doesn't matter what level you put out there. They don't want their European regulators to start adopting American practices. Canada's a little bit different. Like they also have been using it. They don't, the way that they manage like equine and pets is a little differently than they do livestock. So they've had more hemp feed products in market in those capacities and like companion animals and such, but they still haven't been able to get it into livestock either. And their application process is a little longer, a little more arduous. They do have the opportunity to apply for several different ingredients and several different species at one time. And so I know that they're working hard and hopefully we're going to be submitting that this year. But I don't think that we should perpetuate this fear mongering that this application and these standards are the end all be all and we'll never be able to change that. That's not the case. And if you look at other agricultural ingredients that AAFCO has worked with in the past, we have seen that they have changed, right? That's why there's a new book that comes out every year. Every year they go through and industry people or regulators, advocate for changes in the AAFCO publication. So I think we should let that, history be the guiding light that this isn't just a hemp thing. Other ingredients have things too, whether it's increased inclusion rates or increased, contaminant thresholds. Like there are things, this isn't, carved in stone. This is a bit of a moving target, and we can continue to advocate for changes.
I think actually one of the advantages of getting this passed is that it's more going to be easier in the future to make these adjustments because we have set up a series of studies that ultimately the FDA has accepted. And so we can easily replicate these studies that the FDA is comfortable with, providing them, again, if we have hemp seed meal that happens to have higher cannabinoid levels than we have now, it is very easy to replicate this study, albeit not free. It is easy to replicate.
Okay. I think my next question, like maybe this is just based in some cynicism, and I apologize for that, but is there like any part of the, like, I'll just come out and say it, like, are cannabinoid growers concerned about this hemp seed policy? Like,
I would hope
is part of this?
I would hope not, because we're not getting seed meal from
right. Nobody's selling
product.
Cannabinoid seed into the hemp feed market. All right. So it's not like there's this part of the industry that just has naturally higher cannabinoid content that might have some seed and they feel excluded from this part of the market.
I don't think that's the case, but I do think there is concern of just that sector of the industry to not want any sort of established threshold, published, right? So they may not make hemp seed meal. They may not have a direct correlation to the product and markets that they may be playing in, but they may see this as a threat that there is an established limit and they don't want to see that low of a limit in market, even though they don't make hemp seed meal. I do think that there are some organizations and some advocates on that sector of the business that they don't want to see anything published, right? Because whether their products are on the market, this just like we point to the grass application that was went in so many years ago. We point to that sort of as like our guiding light of like, well, this is what FDA, you guys looked at a grass application for hemp foods and you didn't have concerns here. I bet you that there are some people who are concerned of, hey, well, they're going to reference this limit. And even though it's a different ingredient product. So I guess I could see that being a concern.
I think it's also important, Eric, that everyone understand that the Hemp Feed Coalition is not advocating for cannabinoid limits. We would prefer that there was no threshold on cannabinoids at all. Unfortunately, that is not how the FDA sees it. So we're working within the framework that we have, but we would like to see some sort of ruling from the FDA on safe human standards or no limits at all to make this process easier, because when you look at the application timeline, and for us, it's been over 4 years since we filed that original application, the slowest part of this process has been dealing with this cannabinoid issue. And we as well would like to get beyond it and not have to discuss this as part of the feed ingredient.
I keep coming back to the headline. Tentative definition for hemp seed meal has been described as a poison pill for the hemp industry. And it's like it's self-referential because the headline is saying, because this is the only place that thing is being called a poison pill, right? Like who else is calling it a poison pill? And I don't this is such a good achievement for the hemp industry, just getting that tentative approval, and it looks like approval in August. Like, I don't understand the logic that went into this, honestly. Like, why? It seems like a hand grenade, to be honest.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good time to talk about the consequences if we don't get this approved, right? I think that's like a little bit of the elephant in the room for me that people don't really appreciate. Obviously, time, money, and effort went into this. We want to see it across the finish line. But what happens if we don't, right? What are the implications that we could see on the backside of that? First and foremost, it's a minimum, 12 to 18 months before we can resubmit, because we'll have to go back. We'll have to go do all that data again. We'll have to go do that trial again. So time and money, that's things. And if you don't know already, HFC is a nonprofit. All of us are volunteers. We don't have time or money, right? So that's one, first and foremost. Secondly, if you talk to anyone in actual agriculture, like big ag, they understand the value that a feed market brings to a commodity. If you don't have a feed market, you're not a commodity, right? You have to have those outlets. And so just the fact that we're able as an industry to say, hey, we have a feed approved, and we can start looking at scalable manufacturing, and we can start looking at meeting competitive commodity pricing. Now, money, investors, manufacturers, we start to get a seat at the table with other commodities. And that is so critical, right? You got to have that first toe in the water sort of thing. And so if we don't, right, if we decide that it's more important for us to advocate for this threshold of cannabinoids in August, and we, create fear in our regulators that they can't manage this ingredient, then we've proven all of those, naysayers in the industry that say hemp cannot be a commodity, that hemp doesn't have a place in agriculture. We're just feeding into their narrative because we're showing them that, we can't even get laying hens approved, right? So this is really critical for us to establish a baseline to start getting credibility and recognition as a commodity crop and these manufacturing practices, and allowing some partners to start working with, bigger investors, and people are looking at opportunities. Renewable fuel is a big thing on people's mind right now, and they are considering hemp as a renewable fuel source. But when you have oil, you have meal. That is, you can't have one without the other. And it's, 7 times more abundant in meal by volume. So what are you going to do with all that meal when you go make renewable fuel? So people aren't going to start looking at those opportunities, in earnest and considering investing without this light at the end of the tunnel of an opportunity to sell hemp seed meal into a feed market.
Well, I think that there's an important point not to forget about here. Even if we want to go down the road of increasing the cannabinoid levels, we do have to be conscious of the fact that the samples that we've been working with meet these current standards. So we will have to go hunt for hemp seed meal that has higher cannabinoid levels, and that may not be as easy as what we want it to be. So we should keep in mind, again, we are being measured solely by the stick that we gave them, which is real samples, not just from one processor, not just from 2 processors, but multiple processors that have shown an ability without extreme effort through their regular process to achieve these standards.
Okay. So next steps, what are we doing from here?
So we did reach out to APS to try to, clear the air. We asked them to, change and redact a little bit of what they put out there, and haven't seen that done yet, but hopefully they, will continue to work towards that. And we want to collaborate, like we want to push this forward. But your point, this sounds a little bit like a grenade. We see it the same way, right? We need to work together here, because regulators don't want to say yes. It's in their nature to say no, right? Like it's much easier for us to say no. And so we don't want to give them any excuse not to approve the ingredient in August. And if we don't show confidence in the industry, right? Like this is the hemp industry. And if we're not showing confidence and, coalesce on an information set that we're putting forward now, why would a regulator feel motivated to approve it?
All right. So we will direct listeners to the show page for this episode where they can read your response. They can click over to the Hemp Feed Coalition's website and do all the things. All right. And just to reiterate, so maybe to assuage some fears, but you've heard repeatedly from the regulators, both within AAFCO and FDA CVM, that the definition that you're working on can be amended if you get more data coming in. But the point is, just get it across the finish line, right? Because you're so close.
Yeah. And I would just say, HFC has always been an advocate of safety and science first. And we have to stick to those principles. And, we want the safety of the egg. That's right now, that's what FDA set as the safety threshold. So we're going to adhere to that. And we're going to let the science, the data that, we worked hard to achieve and to get, we're going to also let that lead. So even though we may have personal, ideas of what we think the threshold should be, or maybe there's some other limits out there that are kind of recognized as limits. I think we have to just remember the science has proven to us that these are the thresholds, that we can meet as an industry, that manufacturers can meet, and B, that chickens can eat, and we know that there's no transference. So I don't think there's any room to argue outside of that. It is what it is. And I can't refute the information, and I can't refute their logic of FDA. So if you know me, I'm all about picking a fight with a regulator. So it's unheard of for me to say I can't refute it. It is what it is. And let's just let the science and let's let the safety lead the conversation.
Amen to that. Morgan Tweet, thank you so much for joining me here. Andrew Bish, thank you as well. Andrew and Morgan are from the Hemp Feed Coalition. These are the people who are trying to open up those feed markets, right? So the hemp industry can flourish. Thank you both for the work you do.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you for having us, Eric.
Okay, so Hunter Buffington from Agricultural Policy Solutions. Welcome back to the Lancaster Farming Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm well. Thank you, Eric. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Doing all right. A lot of crazy stuff happening these days, and we're just trying to ride the wave,
it's not boring.
No. All right. So the reason I wanted to talk to you today is about a recent blog post that you published, I guess, last week. And I've heard from other people kind of in the space. Mm-hmm. And before I publish anything, I want to talk to you as well, because you're the person who wrote it. Yes. So I want to be fair and balanced and et cetera.
All right. I appreciate that.
So the blog post in question is titled "Tentative Definition for Hemp Seed Meal has been described as a poison pill for the hemp industry." Just first, if you could give me a brief synopsis of what the issue is, what does this piece say?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to clarify that those were not my words. Those were words actually used by a regulator that I work closely with in a State Department of Agriculture that's charged with testing feed. And this has been an ongoing issue. As you and hopefully many of your listeners know, I was integrally involved in writing and submitting the very first application, that hemp seed laying hens application, when I was the executive director for the Hemp Feed Coalition. So this is not something that I'm brand new to. This is a conversation I've been having for quite some time. And a lot of my recent work has been partnering with ASTM and the other volunteers, many of them analytical chemists, to help develop a GCFID method to test cannabinoids in hemp seed byproducts, specifically looking towards hemp seed meal as it was on the horizon of becoming a new feed ingredient. And the reason that's important, Eric, is...
I'm just clarify, what does JCFIC mean?
Yeah, JCFID, no worries. So what that is it's a detector that uses flame ionization detection. So what it does is it decarboxylizes the material. This was recommended by the USDA in their final rules as a method for the state departments to do compliance around hemp. So typically for 0.3% in hemp products, but then also was adopted by most of the state departments of agriculture for that reason. And the current methodology, the limits of quantification that have been achieved are 200 parts per million. And that is something I've been working directly with the American Association of Feed Control Officials and their Lab Services and Methods Working Group to develop this method and disseminate it amongst the labs. It's not the only method that can be utilized to determine cannabinoid quantification, but it is the most common method for the state feed regulators that's being used in their labs. And so the goal is to get it from that 200 parts per million that I just mentioned to 10 parts per million. And that 10 parts per million is not just a random number. It's chosen strategically because that's what the FDA allowed in whole, complete hemp seed products for human consumption in the GRAS notice that was achieved by Manitoba Harvest. So clearly the difference between 200 and 10 is significant. It's a lot of work. We have gotten the method to the point where we're now cold running it with a couple of labs to see if just handed the method, if they can achieve that limit of quantification at 10 parts per million, which is critical. So
where are they getting the seed that they're testing?
It depends. Most of them are getting it from their own states, right? But for the validation purposes of this method, everyone is going to be using the same material, which was the cold method right now is being utilized from material that came from Canada. It was a donated hemp seed meal. We are going to do a precision and bias testing once we get the lab method validated through the ASTM process. That's actually in partnership with the USDA, who is looking to understand better where we have variability in results. And because hemp seed meal has only trace amounts of cannabinoids in comparison with what would be a compliant flower as a hemp product, right? That 0.3 is 3,000 parts per million. So we're talking about 0.001 at 10 parts per million, right? So your precision and bias is much more affected by variability at those very small quantifications. So that's a long answer for the reason that this was described as a poison pill, for the fact that many of the state regulators are going to struggle to, in fact, assure that products that are made with hemp seed meal are not adulterated.
Okay. First, can you tell me who that regulator who used the phrase poison pill was?
No.
Cannot. Okay.
That will definitely disrupt my relationship and confidence with the regulators I work with.
Right. So explain to me, because granted, I'm a simpleton, right? So just explain to me why it's a poison pill. Just help me figure out why the definition now, I guess it's just those targets are just too low. It's going to be hard for grain producers to produce seed with those levels of cannabinoids.
So It's not an issue of necessarily producing seed. Remember that the seed does not naturally produce cannabinoids. That's been acknowledged by the FDA, but it is a contaminant. And the cannabinoids are quite sticky, and they're wrapped in the flower material and the leaf material as they're produced. And so the contamination is from adherence to the outside of the seed shell. And the definition that we proposed did not qualify a dehulled seed. So the results from the testing that I've seen, it's easy to achieve if you're dehulling seed. There is a different definition and limit for dehulled seed that came from the FDA, but the definition that we're working with is for whole seed. So I don't work in a vacuum. While I work really closely with the regulators in the states, and I know a number of states that from the regulatory perspective, if it was at 2 parts per million, a limit that they cannot achieve, they would simply not test the material in their labs. And so it would prevent them from adhering to an acceptance. So that is part of the big problem. If they can't prove that it's not adulterated, then they don't want it in their lab, especially because many of these labs have DEA regulations on top of their hemp compliance, right? Right? We know that, right? Most of them are DEA regulations. Okay. So the other thing I was saying is that I am not working in a vacuum. This isn't a personal issue. Rather, this has been presented to me by my constituents, not just in the United States, but I also work closely with the Canadian producers through my relationship with the Federation of International Hemp Organizations. And I have had the opportunity to speak with Manitoba Harvest, and they ran some additional tests, or at least they did some work to see if they could be compliant at these limits. And that response led to a letter being penned from the Canadian Hemp Trade Alliance in opposition to the current limits as well. So this is not just Hunter Buffington running around saying that this is a problem. And I wanted to make sure that people know that the poison pill was not my words. And it was a distinction between what the FDA is able to achieve and what the state regulators who are actually charged with enforcement and regulation of animal feeds are able to do in their labs.
Okay. Couple of questions. So you mentioned your constituents. Who are your constituents? Like, who do you represent? Mm-hmm. And who funds you?
Yeah, so I have a diverse portfolio because I work across the supply chain. I do a lot of work in sustainability and regenerative agriculture, which is what brought me to hemp. I work with farmers across the country that are commodity producers who also grow hemp in Kentucky, in Texas, in Colorado, Washington State, as well as in North Dakota. A majority of them are seed producers, either for replanting or they're actually producing seed for crushing and product development. So that's some of the constituents that I work with. And then I also, as the ASTM Industrial Hemp Subcommittee leader, have access to a wealth of intellectual capacity and expertise because of the membership of that organization. Now, that's where the analytical chemistry is being developed. I'm definitely not a chemist. Those folks are integral to so much of this discussion, and that's how I have the opportunity to work with them. And then through the Federation of International Hemp Organizations, and then a longtime relationship with the Canadian Hemp Trade Alliance, I have access to a very well known. I mean, Manitoba Harvest is well known in North America, obviously responsible for that very first, or the first 3 GRAS notices for human consumption. And also the CHTA is working closely with their Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And their representative was also responsive that this would not be a good next step for the industry, because who does Canada export a large number, a large amount? I don't know off the top of my head the most recent amount, but it's certainly over 60% of their export that comes to the United States. And everyone needs this animal feed market. Everyone needs it.
Oh yeah. The whole thing hinges on this feed
absolutely.
market.
So many parts of the supply chain are contingent on this, and the clarity of being able to crush whole seed also diversifies the feedstock. So chickens are fed a much more ideal hemp product when it's dehulled, because they don't need the fiber, whereas our ruminant species are going to need the fiber. And so that was the intention with the definition, was that while this one was focused on those laying hens, that the definition would be able to move forward for other species and categories as soon as it was approved.
Sure. Right.
So there's, multiple components.
And you're suggesting like lowering the THC limit and getting rid of the CBD limit altogether?
There, to my knowledge, and I just spent some time reviewing international organizations, which is a whole lot of a lot, and then also a lot of nothing, because some states just don't present their regulations in a way that I can get to them. But generally, the issue is that no jurisdiction that I'm aware of for animal feed has a CBD limit. And certainly a 20 parts per million CBD limit is quite low. Again, if we're using whole crushed seed that is clean normally, then it's a difficult for that achievement. And I've heard that from multiple constituents as well as from CHTA. CHTA has penned their own letter, and I'm happy, Eric, to connect you to Ted Haney and the person who wrote that letter for some follow-up, so that you can get opinions outside of myself.
All right. So from my understanding, there's the definition for laying hens that's already, it's been given sort of tentative approval by the FDA, VCM. It's coming up to a vote. Did I have that acronym right? I'm sorry.
No, FDA CVM was right. So the process starts with AAFCO, then goes to FDA CVM, and then it comes back to AAFCO, and AAFCO voted to approve the tentative definition this summer.
And it comes up for a final vote, in August, right?
That's correct.
And my understanding is that that definition can then be amended after the vote, right?
So there are two pathways. I was told that it would be easier to make recommendations before the second and final approval, that the opportunity to make suggestions to the committee was right now. In fact, we have an April meeting, and that was the target, to bring forth the concerns over these limits. And I had a number of conversations, not only with the Lab Services Committee membership at AAFCO, but then also the Ingredient Definitions Committee chairperson. However, Eric, we did have a conversation with the Hemp Feed Coalition recently, because I was very frustrated. I felt that the industry needed to see the definition, understand what was at stake, especially when we're putting CBD in for the first time.
Hasn't the definition kind of been publicly out there for a while now? Like, don't people see it? Like, isn't it there? It's the way you said that, it sounded like they were hiding it.
Did you see it in any of the press releases?
I feel like they explained it in some of the press releases. But actual language,
the definition or the limits?
I feel like I was told the limits for THC and CBD, but I don't know. I don't know. So I'm just trying to, talk to the different people and sort of figure out what's happening, just so other people in the industry can sort of get a sense of what this issue is.
Right. And my goal was twofold. The first one was to say, here's the definition and here's the feedback. I have constituents who are very concerned, and I work specifically in a lot of policy and regulatory environments. And my goal is to represent my constituents, not a single voice, right? To make sure that I'm also doing due diligence and reaching to the manufacturers who are going to be the suppliers. So when I do that and I hear from them that they haven't seen the definition, and when I share with them the limits and they go back and they say, these are going to be difficult for us to reach, and it is in fact a problem.
And those constituents are growing for grain. They're not growing like, tri-purpose crops, or they're growing.
And some of them are growing replant seed as well. But remember that replant seed is going to be integral to the feed market, because any off-spec seed that you have that's not able to go forward for replanting, where's it going to go? That animal feed market is a perfect opportunity for that seed to have an offtake market if it's not going to be replanted.
Right. But that kind of seems secondary to the larger goal of just getting hemp grain into the livestock feed market. Like, it sounds like you're saying that there are some constituents who are going to be growing hemp seed, and maybe is it CBD seed? And so maybe that content, that those seeds would be more contaminated with a higher cannabinoid content because it was grown for floral purposes. I don't know.
I'm just a lot more time. I've got like 4 more minutes, Eric, and I want to be very clear that the goal is to make sure that hemp grain products and seed products are normalized. Why are we promoting limits outside of what is achievable by a majority of regulatory labs that are below contaminants that we know are harmful? It is the same limit as 1 heavy metal, significantly below 2 other heavy metals. And I would say that when we look at therapeutic or pharmacological dosages, we are orders of magnitude below even achieving any kind of outcome from these limits. If we move forward with a definition that limits the ability for our producers currently in the marketplace, and for a large producer that led development of the hemp industry in the United States, I'm talking about Manitoba Harvest, because of their GRAS notifications, and they have concerns that they're not going to be able to meet these limits, we've done a disservice to the industry. We've done a disservice to our farmers. And it's, in my opinion, it is up to those of us that work in the regulatory environment to understand the process. And if I can be so bold, to actually work together instead of shooting arrows. I've reached out multiple times. I've tried to have communications. I believe you probably saw my update that the outcome of our meeting, I thought, was very positive, that we were going to be working together. That was my request. That's the reason, even after reaching out to HFC, that I moved forward with the post. I sat on that post for a very long time because it was not the way that I wanted to move this industry forward. I'm tired of not being able to work together. And that was the goal I was trying to achieve. I thought we had achieved it, but based on the recent HFC post, I guess I'm not sure. And my partners and I are waiting. We've had some additional communications, but when we left that meeting, my understanding is that we were intending to work together, that we were going to have monthly conversations and work together for the benefit of our constituents, because we have probably the same farmers. Not going to lie. I definitely know I have farmers that are on the HFC. And it's time. It's time for us to get out of our own way, figure out how to work together, and do what's best for the industry.
Fair enough. Thank you for sharing that. It's part of it. Me feels like, it's like letting the good be the enemy of the perfect. Like, it seems like we're so close to getting this first step approved, and then there are, opportunities to change it afterwards. It's like, I don't know. Something feels off to me, to be honest.
Remember, I was told that it would be easier to change it now before the final definition. That's the information I was given from some of the folks that I work most closely with at AAFCO. So I compromised with HFC and said, this is what I was told. But if you're willing to do a definitional change and a modification that way, then I will come to the table and I will work with you. But I was definitely told that it would be far easier to do it at this next April meeting than before summer.
Okay.
And that's, honestly, Eric, that's probably the differences between federal jurisdictions and state jurisdictions. But I do want to mention that there's also another issue that's happening right now that I think is important to the context of our discussion. And that is there's legislation to remove the state influence on regulation of pet and animal and livestock food. That's probably a conversation we should have
that
separately.
Seems like a different conversation.
I think it's important to know that the landscape, the regulatory landscape, is challenging, not just for hemp, but this is another area where that the tug of war between federal and state jurisdiction is also happening right now with animal feed. So trying to navigate that on top of the whole hemp birthing process. That's really what it feels like. Right. I mean, not that you've had that experience, but
you mean giving birth?
If you've been in the room. So yeah, it's painful. It takes longer than anyone hopes. Right. But I think that it's important for us to communicate, and it's important for us to figure out how to work together.
Okay. Do you how much of this is sort of like based in fear of THC, like reefer madness?
Oh, wow. So it's funny because, as I mentioned, I've been doing research around the international landscape of hemp regulation, and there's no escaping the impact of international drug trafficking laws on what has happened with hemp regulation. And I would say, Eric, that the onset of D8 and hemp-derived cannabinoids, which I want to be clear, those are isomer THC molecules, right? That's not CBD. And while they may be naturally occurring in the plant, not at these levels. And this is also not supplements.
Right.
We're not making peppermint oil or hemp seed oil when we're chemically modifying these molecules. So unfortunately, I think there's a lot of pushback on, I typically try to avoid the words reefer madness, but I'll tell you, when these limits are lower than heavy metals that we know are concerning, when they're lower than the limits necessary to label a product as gluten-free, then I think our priorities are misaligned.
Hunter Buffington from Agriculture Policy Solutions.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your perspective today.
Thank you for having me, Eric, and thank you for letting me share that perspective and acknowledge my farmers. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Morgan, welcome back. I just had a call with Hunter Buffington from Agriculture Policy Solutions about the poison pill blog post, and she brought up a couple of points that I just wanted to run by you and get your feedback on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the first was we were talking about the definition for the hemp seed meal, the thing that's been tentatively approved and it's going to go up for the vote in August. And she asked me, she's like, well, did you see the definition? Was there? And she caught me off guard. I was like, I feel like I read about it, but I don't know if I actually saw the language of the definition. And she said that it wasn't publicly available and that she didn't see it. No one saw it. So she wanted to, one of the reasons why she published this blog post was to get that definition out there. That was the first reason. So a response to that, like, is there a publicly available, or had there been a publicly available version of the language that people can see?
Yeah. So prior to AAFCO, there was not a public one. That is because, the process is proprietary in nature. Actually, Hemp Feed Coalition is probably one of the only associations that is like a group of people that have applied for these things. It's more typical of private industries and private sectors. And I would just take a quick second to go down that. I think that's indicative because we are looking at an ingredient as like a full, full product line, right? We're talking about hemp seed meal as an ingredient versus a lot of people or businesses are pursuing applications for more proprietary or specialty ingredients, right? Whereas this is a commodity, hemp seed meal, like soybean meal. And I go back to if we were grandfathered in like other commodities like soybean meal or flax meal, like those ingredients didn't go through the same process we're going through. But this is the future, or this is the reality we live in. So that's where it is. So it's a little more proprietary in nature. But as soon as it was on the agenda for the ingredient definition committee, it was public through AAFCO. After AAFCO got the vote, we put it on our website. We put it through our newsletter. And I can understand her maybe concerns that, why wasn't it public? But really, the definition doesn't really give us that much anyways. And I'm fine to read it again here, the part that she's probably concerned about. The product is obtained by grinding or milling the cake, which remains after most of the oil is removed from the seeds of cannabis sativa L by a mechanical extraction process. Then it goes on to talk about the cannabinoid thresholds. So it's one line, right? And it's basically mechanical extraction. Like that's the detail that the definition goes into. Now, obviously, we talked earlier in the week about the manufacturing chemistry, which we had to go in detail about. And that was not a private conversation. That was circulated. We had a steering committee. We had, at that time, there was at least a half dozen different hemp seed processors that contributed to the penning of that, manufacturing definition. She was a part of that. And, I had to chat with her earlier in the week of last week and reminded her that, we've had these conversations. You were part of that. It was never changed. And if we would have called out something special other than mechanical extraction, it likely would have been in this definition. And since it's not, I think that the public should have been comfortable that we were doing a good job of representing industry. I think another thing to say is HFC has a really good reputation. If you look at who our board members are, myself included as the executive director, we are not just people who don't know what we're doing and that don't have intimate knowledge of the industry. We are processors, we are farmers, we are, seed breeders. Like we are the people that have the most to lose and arguably the most to gain. So why would we write a definition that wouldn't be advantageous for that collective group that's represented within HFC? So I think I push back a little bit too of like, people trust HFC because they trust the people that HFC is made up of. And the concerns that she may raise about us, trying to slide something through, we haven't had that concern from anyone else because people trust us as a group.
I'm a Pennsylvanian. I'm a proud Pennsylvanian. And you do have a connection to Pennsylvania there on the board, right? Can you tell me about, I guess his name is Raj?
Yeah, Raj Kasula. He was part of Wanger Feed. They were the group that did the study and have commercial hens or making a commercial feed for a hen operation and did Chickies Creek. You talked about it on your podcast before. He's on the board. He's, reviewing these applications. He's a great example of, if somebody would have been concerned about how the application was currently written to meet his needs as a user of hemp seed meal, he probably would have voiced those concerns, well in advance of us submitting that.
Okay. The other thing she said she wanted to get the definition out there, but if I'm understanding you correctly, that had been public knowledge since it went through AAFCO. So what was that? End of January, beginning of February?
End of January.
Okay. All right. And I will put a link to the AAFCO version of that definition on the show page for the episode. The other thing she was saying is that she wanted to make these concerns public because it's her understanding that changes to this definition, it was recommended to her that these would be easier to make before the vote in August rather than after the vote in August.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate to hear her say that again, because her and I have talked a couple times now about, I heard the exact opposite. And, maybe it's a he said, she said sort of thing. But I think that we could go to the record. Charlotte Conway with FDA CVM. She's the director that, manages the people who review. So, her authority is pretty high. On the record at the AAFCO meeting said this is something we can amend. this is something that we can change. If you put forth data, we're happy to look at that. So I guess, if she's hearing from other individuals, I guess I would probably defer to the FDA regulator and think that we have a pretty good opportunity to change things. And I've also heard from other people too outside of Charlotte. But again, I think that sort of the buck stops with FDA CBM. So.
Okay. And she was talking about, I'm not sure what the right term is, but like seed stock, like growers who are growing grain to then plant, right? And wanted to make sure that those folks, like if their seed wasn't up to standards for planting, that it could then easily go into the livestock market. And my response to that was like, well, that kind of seems secondary to like this larger, grain commodity crop that's just trying to get, like a legal footing here.
Yeah, that might be, we clearly didn't get samples from all varieties all over seed stocks. We can't overcome that. So is there a chance that there's some, varieties and seed that if propagated for future production, let's say floral, right? A seed stock that was propagated for floral production, the variety has been bred for higher cannabinoid content. And for whatever reasons, it doesn't, meet germination or things like that. Is there a chance that that seed may not be able to reach cannabinoid thresholds? Theoretically, she's not wrong, right? That's maybe a thing. But to your point, that is very low on the totem pole of opportunities, in my opinion. And let's be frank, floral bred genetics, they're not breeding at a volume that they're going to be looking at commercial applications for off-spec seed. If they are, they're probably not a great business model and are going to be out of business pretty soon anyways, right? So, we can talk a lot about the what ifs, and we can talk a lot about, the concerns of where it is. And I said it to her too, is I don't disagree with her that I would like to see cannabinoids higher, but I also cannot disagree or refute with the data that was presented in the commercial hemp application that showed cannabinoid levels below 20 ppm. And so I think we just need to stay the course and get this application approved. And we've proven as an industry through the sample as I've seen and that were run through Eurofins that, it was more than just that one sample that was able to meet those thresholds. And let's move forward. And then if we need to come back and work on it, we sure can. So
keeping our eyes on the prize, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, because once the whole industry hinges on the livestock feed, right? Like there's so much at stake. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I think, another thing that we, and you can choose to put this in the recording or not, but I think it's something to talk about. I say a little bit, I think that what we're doing is making a bit of a mountain out of a molehill here. I'm not advocating that we do anything like, to disguise what we're doing here. But the more we talk about cannabinoids, the more emphasis that we as an industry put towards it, no wonder regulators are scared of it.
It muddies the water. Yeah.
Well, and no wonder they don't know what's safe because we as an industry just continue to focus on it. And so this would be like a great point of oh my gosh, we could highlight and celebrate this victory of hemp as a protein source, right? And a fantastic fat. And yet we're still talking about cannabinoids. And so it's just, it's unfortunate. I thought that as an industry, we could all align that we need to be the leaders to change the narrative to get FDA, CBM, AAFCO off of zero with cannabinoids. And yet we're the ones bringing them back to this same conversation. So that's just frustrating.
Morgan Tweet, thank you so much for clarifying these things for me. It's great to talk to you again.
Yes, you as well. Thanks for the call.
All right, there you go. This is our special episode. Thank you for listening. And thank you to Hunter and Morgan and Andrew for joining me on really short notice this week to put this episode together. This grain issue, as you may have heard during this episode, is really important. It's important to the whole industry. So much depends on getting those livestock feed markets opened up. So anyway, I hope you have a better understanding of what's at stake and what the issues are here. And what I'm trying to do is just, provide a place for the voices to be heard. So if you have questions about anything you heard here today, or concerns or comments or whatever, I'd love to hear from you. You can always reach me by email at podcast@lancasterfarming.com. But also the folks at the Hemp Feed Coalition will also take your calls and questions. And I know Hunter at Agriculture Policy Solutions will also take your comments and questions. So I'll have their contact info on the show page for this episode, as well as links to the poison pill post and HFC's response to that post. So that pretty much does it for me. Gotta get out of here. It's the weekend, right? And we're headed to Colorado next week. So lots to do before then. Hope to see you there. My name is Eric Herlock. I am the senior digital editor at Lancaster Farming Newspaper, the greatest agricultural newspaper in the world. Check us out online at lancasterfarming.com. All right, so until next time, I'll see you in the newspaper, maybe in Estes Park, Colorado, maybe in some airport somewhere. All right, so travel safe, and see you next time.
Industrial hemp.
This special bonus episode of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is copyright 2024 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show is written, recorded, edited, and produced by Eric Herlock, with additional production help from Matt Lee. The music you hear throughout the show is courtesy of Tinbird Shadow.